Pippa Middleton just shattered the fairy tale. What she finally revealed at 41 changes everything we thought about her marriage. It was the marriage the tabloids envied, glamorous, powerful, untouchable. But behind the smiles and designer gowns, something was quietly unraveling. At 41, Pippa Middleton has now admitted what insiders had whispered for years. There were secrets, betrayals, and possibly hidden affairs on both sides. In this exclusive deep dive, we uncover what pushed the royal sister-in-law to walk away from James Matthews and the shocking role infidelity may have played. From hushed arguments behind palace doors to unverified tips that could blow this wide open, this story is more than a breakup. It's a revelation. Stay with us. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the fairy tale you've believed in for years suddenly shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces? What if the picture-perfect marriage, the luxurious life, the elegant smiles on the red carpet, all carefully curated for the public eye, hid behind it a reality so painful, so private, that even close family members refused to speak about it? What really happened between Pippa Middleton and her husband James Matthews, the man once dubbed by tabloids as a dream match for the sister of a future queen? It was the wedding that had everything: grandeur, exclusivity, royal guests, and an air of timeless romance. The world watched as Pippa Middleton, already a household name after captivating global attention as maid of honor at her sister Kate's royal wedding, walked down the aisle in a bespoke lace gown, arm in arm with the successful, wealthy, and reserved James Matthews. To most, it was a match written in stars. To others, it was a strategic alignment. Old money meets the Middletons' new elegance. But now, at 41, Pippa Middleton has done the unthinkable. She's admitted, for the first time, the actual reason behind the quiet, almost surgical disintegration of her marriage. And it has nothing to do with public duty, growing apart, or media pressure. It goes far deeper than that. Beneath the champagne toasts, the countryside retreats, and the impeccably coordinated family portraits lies something darker, something personal. Allegations of infidelity, hidden, denied, whispered about behind closed doors, have risen to the surface. And now, they are impossible to ignore. This video will take you through the real story. Not the polished photos you've seen in magazines. Not the carefully worded press releases that give nothing away. This is about what actually went wrong. How a marriage that seemed to be a beacon of discretion and loyalty began to fall apart. It's a journey into secrets, betrayal, silence, and finally, admission. But before we dive in, let's rewind. Because to understand the weight of this confession, you have to understand what was at stake. You have to grasp how high the pedestal was before it cracked. Pippa Middleton never asked for the spotlight. Unlike her sister, she wasn't born into royalty, but she might as well have been. The night before the royal wedding in 2011, Pippa was a name. By the next morning, she was a sensation. The way she carried herself in that fitted bridesmaid gown caught the attention of millions. Paparazzi followed her every step. Tabloids speculated relentlessly about her dating life. Every outing, every gym visit, every whispered romance turned into a headline. And through it all, Pippa smiled, kept her head high, and said nothing. Then James Matthews entered the picture. Older, wealthy, discreet. A man with a powerful financial background and a calm demeanor that seemed to counterbalance the frenzy around Pippa. Their courtship was quiet, often under the radar, in stark contrast to the royal circus Kate endured. When they finally married in 2017, the world exhaled. Here was Pippa finally at peace, living her own version of a royal dream without the official titles. It seemed like she had everything: a handsome husband, an enviable lifestyle, and soon after, beautiful children. But as the years passed, something began to shift. Insiders noticed the couple appearing less and less together in public. James became noticeably absent from family events where he was once ever present. Friends who once posted couple photos from lavish vacations suddenly stopped tagging Pippa. Her name began popping up alone in charity events, solo outings, and more frequently, alone at her children's school functions. And yet, no one spoke. Not her, not her family, not even the press, who seemed unusually respectful, as if tiptoeing around something they couldn't quite confirm. The silence, though, wasn't peace. It was protection. And now, that protection has cracked. In recent months, reports began to surface, first quietly, through anonymous sources, then with more confidence. Whispers of James's long business trips not aligning with the stories given to the public. Stories of private arguments behind closed doors. Alleged late-night phone calls that didn't add up. And then, the word no one wanted to say out loud: infidelity. At first, it seemed inconceivable. James Matthews had never shown signs of scandal. He was the quiet one, the grounded one, the one who kept Pippa tethered to normalcy. But soon, speculation turned sharper. Anonymous insiders hinted at Pippa's own growing suspicions. Her quiet, composed appearances suddenly carried an air of distraction. Photos captured her looking away, not smiling. Something was clearly wrong. And finally, Pippa did what no one expected. She spoke. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't an interview on primetime television. It wasn't even a prepared statement. It was private at first. A conversation between Pippa and someone close, where she reportedly admitted that her marriage had been deeply wounded by betrayal. That behind her loyalty and silence was a quiet devastation. That she had held on for years, not just for love, but for image, for family unity, and for her children. But eventually she could no longer pretend. And now, that confession is spreading. Not just as gossip, but as truth. The truth of a woman who endured, who presented a united front, who kept the secrets for the sake of dignity, and who, finally, decided to reclaim her story. This video will unpack everything: the origins of this relationship, the whispers that followed, the denial, the truth that emerged, and how it all led to Pippa Middleton, at 41, standing at the edge of a fractured dream. No more pretending. No more quiet smiles. This is about betrayal, awakening, and ultimately, courage. We will take you through the story in detail. The rise, the unraveling, and the fallout. You will hear the conflicting narratives. The perspective from Pippa's circle. The silence from James. And the public's stunned reaction. By the end of this journey, you may not see Pippa Middleton the same way again. Not as a secondary royal figure. Not as the sister of a future queen. But as a woman who lived through betrayal and chose truth. Are you ready to hear the part of the story no one dared to print? To the public, it began like a classic modern-day fairy tale. Pippa Middleton, the younger sister of Catherine, Princess of Wales, had spent years orbiting the periphery of royal fame. She wasn't royalty, but she had walked alongside it, spoken beside it, smiled with it. And in the media's eyes, that made her royalty enough. The press nicknamed her Royal Hotness, an unrelenting label that stuck to her like glue from the moment she stepped into Westminster Abbey in 2011. But Pippa Middleton was never just a sister of. She had ambitions, intelligence, and a desire for a life beyond the tabloids. And then came James Matthews. James was the ideal match, at least on paper. Older than Pippa by several years, he carried the aura of old money, not by title, but by legacy. His father, David Matthews, was the Laird of Glen Affric in Scotland, and James himself was a former race car driver turned hedge fund manager. He was calm, measured, and deeply private. To a woman whose every gym visit was analyzed for meaning, a man who shunned public attention seemed like sanctuary. Their romance didn't make the headlines in its early stages. It was quiet, slow, and intentional. At first, they dated briefly in 2012 but went their separate ways. She was linked to Nico Jackson, a stockbroker, and James returned to his business life. But in 2015, they reunited, and this time, something clicked. By 2016, James had proposed during a romantic getaway in the Lake District. No paparazzi. No grand gestures broadcast online. Just two people who seemed to be building something away from the noise. The wedding was nothing short of extraordinary. On May 20th, 2017, Pippa and James were married in the quaint yet elegant St. Mark's Church in Englefield, Berkshire. The guest list included royalty, Prince William, Prince Harry, and yes, Meghan Markle. Pippa walked down the aisle in a custom Giles Deacon gown that combined tradition with modernity. She was poised, stunning, and every bit the woman people had admired for years. The reception took place at her family's estate, complete with a glass palace built specifically for the occasion. Guests arrived by vintage cars and left late into the night. It was everything society magazines dreamed of. But what mattered more than the extravagance was the message it sent. Pippa, after years of speculation and harsh headlines, was finally writing her own chapter. No longer merely Kate's sister, she was now the wife of a multi-millionaire financier. A woman of her own status, her own world, her own power. And perhaps most importantly, it all looked genuine. In the first 2 years of marriage, Pippa and James appeared to be living that very dream. The two were often photographed leaving their Chelsea townhouse, attending tennis matches at Wimbledon, or taking discreet vacations in the Alps. James never spoke to the press. Pippa kept her answers vague and polished. When they welcomed their first child, Arthur, in 2018, she gave rare interviews about motherhood and family life, but always within safe boundaries. She wrote about parenting in the calmest, most orderly tone imaginable. No messiness. No signs of chaos. They embodied the illusion of a couple who had figured it out: balance, love, and longevity in the face of relentless public scrutiny. Even more telling was Pippa's ability to remain graceful amidst royal chaos. As Meghan Markle's arrival shifted royal dynamics and intensified media firestorms, Pippa stayed in the background, poised and polite. She wasn't dragged into palace drama. She didn't take sides. She didn't even hint at discomfort. While newspapers ignited over feuds between royal sisters-in-law, Pippa kept her head down and her image intact. And yet, there were signs. Small ones. Easily dismissed, but noticeable to the keen observer. First, there was the gradual reduction in joint public appearances. After Arthur's birth, James was less frequently photographed with Pippa at events. At the time, it was easy to chalk it up to parenting duties or professional commitments. Then, there was Pippa's growing independence. She took on more charity work solo. She was seen running errands alone, often with Arthur, and increasingly without her wedding ring. There was no grand statement, no obvious fallout. But something had shifted, and in hindsight, it was in these moments. The slow fading of a shared spotlight, that the foundation of the marriage began to show its cracks. Friends who once dined with the couple noticed a change in tone. James, once charismatic in intimate settings, became withdrawn. Pippa, once radiant in conversation, seemed guarded. They were rarely seen engaging in the playful, off-guard moments that had once made their relationship feel genuine. At public events, they arrived and departed with precision. No lingering glances. No casual affection. And then came the decision to relocate to Berkshire, a move that seemed, at first, to be about family life. They purchased a grand £15 million estate not far from her parents' home in Bucklebury. To outsiders, it looked like the natural next step for a couple with a growing family. More space, more privacy, more security. But to those close to them, the move carried weight. It was Pippa returning to her roots, literally and symbolically. Back to the security of the Middleton name. Back to the embrace of her family. Behind that move, some sources suggest, was something deeper. A need to distance herself from the life she had carefully built with James in London. Whispers emerged of disagreements over how to raise their children, over their future in the public eye, over the distance James reportedly kept due to work. Some even claimed James spent extended periods abroad, investing in overseas properties or managing fund portfolios, excuses that left Pippa home alone, carrying the emotional and logistical weight of their lives. Still, the Middleton Code of Silence held strong. Nothing was said publicly. There were no legal filings. No tabloid leaks from either party. Even amid the growing distance, the image remained polished. And that was the point. For both Pippa and James, public perception was not just a priority, it was a currency. And neither was willing, at least not then, to spend it carelessly. But if perfection was the picture, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the frame was beginning to bend. The illusion of the perfect image persisted longer than it should have. Not because it was real, but because it had to be. For the sake of children. For the sake of legacy. For the sake of public judgment. And in the age of curated Instagram lives and filtered truths, the story of Pippa and James was no different. What the world saw was a beautiful estate, smiling faces, carefully selected photographs. What it didn't see was the emotional withdrawal, the growing frustration, the private arguments. There's a saying in elite social circles, everything looks fine until the silence becomes deafening. And that's exactly what happened here. The silence was no longer graceful. It was eerie. As the years passed, what was once considered elegant discretion began to feel like a cover. A facade. A way to buy time before admitting that something had gone terribly wrong. By the time whispers of infidelity began surfacing, it didn't feel like a betrayal of a perfect marriage. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the cracks people thought they saw were real. That behind Pippa's composed expression was a woman holding something unbearable. That James's silence wasn't professionalism, it was retreat. And now, as we look back at those early years, those wedding day smiles, those carefully constructed narratives, one can't help but ask, was it ever real? Was the perfect image ever more than just that, a projection, a performance, a well-guarded illusion? Because if the beginning of the story was about love and harmony, its slow unraveling was about the cost of keeping up appearances. And that cost, as Pippa Middleton would later confess, was far too high. It began with whispers, subtle and easily overlooked. For the average observer, Pippa Middleton and James Matthews still seemed to be the picture of composure, of calm, of refinement. There were no dramatic outbursts, no legal filings splashed across newspapers, no telltale signs of collapse. But in the lives of those who know how to navigate high society, appearances are everything, and appearances are often deceiving. The first sign came not from tabloids but from silence. Pippa, once frequently seen at public events alongside her husband, began attending more and more functions alone. At charity galas, fashion events, and even low-profile Middleton family outings, she appeared poised but solitary. Her smile was intact, her posture unshaken, but those who studied her closely noticed the absence. James Matthews, the ever-reserved financier, had quietly removed himself from the scene. He was no longer the permanent fixture at her side. When asked, Pippa offered polite and calculated responses. Business commitments, scheduling conflicts, privacy, words that served more as placeholders than explanations. Inside their social circle, those reasons started to wear thin. Close friends began to speculate quietly, cautiously, about the growing space between the two. James had taken on more international business ventures, and with that came extended absences, trips to Asia, private meetings in Switzerland, corporate dealings in Dubai. It was all very plausible, very professional, but it left Pippa increasingly alone in their sprawling Berkshire estate, managing a household, raising children, and keeping up the appearances expected of someone tethered to royalty. But even more telling than the growing physical distance were the changes in tone between them. According to sources close to the couple, private dinners once filled with light conversation turned into tense, clipped exchanges. Their once easy chemistry began to dissipate. Staff members allegedly noticed the subtle but sharp changes, meals eaten in silence, separate bedrooms during tense periods, sudden and unannounced travel plans. One unnamed source described it simply. It wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a schedule. What made it more painful was the juxtaposition between their public image and their private reality. On social media, fan pages still posted throwbacks to their wedding day. Magazines continued to list Pippa among the most stylish mothers in Britain. But behind closed doors, the dynamic had shifted. There was no shouting, no explosive arguments, just a quiet disconnection, so quiet it went unnoticed for months, perhaps even years. And that, in many ways, made it all the more devastating. The pressure to maintain perfection had created a kind of paralysis. Pippa, raised to prioritize discretion and taught to handle media with grace, wasn't the type to expose her pain. But pain has a way of slipping through the cracks, and hers began to show in unexpected ways. Her presence became more reserved. Her interviews, fewer. Her social media activity, virtually non-existent. Gone were the carefully curated glimpses into her lifestyle. Her fitness routines, her parenting thoughts, her charity projects. In their place was silence. James, on the other hand, grew even more reclusive. Never fond of the spotlight, he had always maintained a quiet distance from media attention. But now, that distance turned into something else, avoidance. He rarely accompanied Pippa to events. He rarely appeared in family photos. He never addressed the growing rumors. It was as if he was disappearing from the narrative entirely. Still, the public remained largely unaware. The Middleton name carried with it a kind of bulletproof dignity. Unlike the royals, who were constantly under scrutiny and scandal, the Middletons managed their image with surgical precision. No leaks, no betrayals, no scandals, at least, not publicly. But in the background, a storm was beginning to brew. Some say it began with a friend, a mutual acquaintance of both Pippa and James, who noticed something unusual. During a dinner party in London, James was seen engaging in what appeared to be an unusually intimate conversation with a woman described only as a longtime associate. The exchange wasn't overtly inappropriate, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. When asked about it later, the response was vague. They were discussing a business matter. Others claimed that the real turning point came when Pippa found messages on James's phone, messages that didn't align with the narrative she had been given. They weren't explicit, but they were suspicious. Too frequent. Too familiar. Too out of place for a man who claimed to be fully committed to his family. She didn't confront him right away. That wasn't her style. She waited, observed, collected more evidence. By this point, Pippa had begun confiding in a very small circle of friends, people who could be trusted not to speak to the press, people who had known her long before the fame. It was through these whispered conversations that a picture began to form. She wasn't just hurt. She felt betrayed, not simply by potential infidelity, but by the slow erosion of honesty in their marriage. There were also murmurs, never confirmed, always denied, that Pippa herself had grown close to another man, someone who had offered emotional support during James's repeated absences, a confidant, a presence, someone who listened. Whether or not anything physical occurred remains uncertain, but the emotional connection, according to those familiar with the situation, was undeniable. By now, the trust between Pippa and James had become fragile, held together by children, public expectation, and the inertia of years. They weren't fighting anymore, but they weren't connecting, either. It was coexistence, not partnership. And the rumors didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. Paparazzi began to show up more frequently outside their estate. Tabloid reports, while still cautious, began hinting at trouble in paradise. Headlines remained vague. Is Pippa's marriage under pressure? Or Middleton Matthews, the cost of privacy? But the implication was clear. People were starting to notice. Pippa, ever the strategist, chose silence. No denials. No confirmations. Just silence. But as one journalist noted, when someone who has always carefully controlled the narrative suddenly stops speaking, that says more than any statement ever could. Behind the scenes, there were discussions. Serious ones. About the future. About the children. About whether their marriage could be salvaged or if they were simply postponing the inevitable. Some suggested couples therapy. Others pushed for a quiet separation, one that could be done discreetly, with minimal public fallout. Pippa, according to insiders, was torn. She had worked so hard to protect her family's name, to maintain a respectable life, to shield her children from the chaos that came with her public status. And walking away from her marriage felt, at times, like a personal failure. But she also knew she couldn't continue to live in a relationship defined by suspicion and distance. It wasn't just about infidelity. It was about erosion. The slow, relentless decline of connection. The vanishing of trust. The absence of effort. And so, she began to prepare quietly, methodically. She spoke to legal advisors. She discussed arrangements with her family. She planned, not just for herself, but for her children's stability. All the while, the world remained unaware of the internal unraveling taking place behind perfectly painted doors. By the time she made her confession that there had indeed been betrayal, that she had stayed too long, that the marriage was broken, it wasn't a shock. It was a release. For her, for those who loved her, for those who had watched the slow disintegration in silence. This was not the dramatic implosion of a Hollywood marriage. There were no public confrontations, no screaming matches caught on camera. It was quieter, more haunting. A story of two people who once loved each other deeply but lost their way in the silence of high society, where discretion is prized over honesty and image outweighs intimacy. And as the cracks deepened, Pippa Middleton made a decision. Not just to end a marriage, but to end the performance. What came next would change everything. The moment the allegations truly surfaced, everything changed. The story was no longer whispered in private clubs or shielded behind closed doors of the Berkshire estate. It was out in the open, raw, unfiltered, and uncontrollable. What had once been just suspicion began forming a shape too detailed to ignore. And while neither Pippa Middleton nor James Matthews had yet released a single official statement, the silence was now being drowned out by something louder, evidence. It began with a leak. A tabloid not known for restraint published a speculative article that hinted at a scandal inside one of Britain's most quietly influential families. The headline was careful, but pointed. Power couple facing hidden strain? The article made no direct accusations but referenced unnamed sources who claimed emotional distance, time apart, and unconfirmed rumors of outside romantic entanglements. For seasoned readers, it was clear what was being implied. At first, the reaction from the public was disbelief. Pippa Middleton had become a symbol of grace under pressure, of calm elegance in a world spinning wildly around her. Could she really be part of a scandal? Could her husband, the stoic financier with a legacy to protect, really be the center of whispered betrayal? But this wasn't a one-off report. Within weeks, other outlets began publishing their own versions of the same story. While some stopped short of naming names, others weren't so cautious. A French tabloid claimed that a woman linked to one of James's overseas business partners had been spotted dining with him during one of his trips to Geneva. An American gossip column suggested that a digital trail of messages existed. Encrypted, deleted, but not unrecoverable. Soon, photos began to emerge. Grainy, long-lens images showing James in conversation with a woman who was clearly not Pippa. The setting was a rooftop bar in New York. The distance between them was questionable, not overtly romantic, but too familiar for comfort. The images, while inconclusive on their own, added fire to the already raging speculation. It didn't take long before people on social media began to connect the dots. The dates of James's international travel lined up with Pippa's solo appearances. The lack of recent public outings. The visible stress she carried in recent photos. The subtle changes in her ring usage. The absence of their usual couple-based charity events. In retrospect, it was all there. And then came the whispers from within. Two separate anonymous sources, both allegedly connected to people who had worked in the couple's Berkshire home, came forward. Their accounts were similar. According to them, tensions had been high for over a year. One insider claimed that James had moved into a separate guest wing of the house during a particularly rough stretch. Another revealed that Pippa had once broken down during a private family gathering, whispering to her mother that she didn't know who he was anymore. The reliability of these sources was, of course, impossible to verify, but the pattern was becoming too strong to dismiss. Allegations no longer stood alone. They were forming a mosaic, detailed, consistent, damning. What stunned many was how methodically Pippa handled it all. Unlike many public figures who faced such scrutiny, she didn't react. She didn't sue. She didn't deny. She didn't even acknowledge the headlines. Instead, she remained composed, almost chillingly so. And that silence said more than words ever could. Meanwhile, James Matthews made no move to counter the story. His absence from the media was expected, but even in private circles, he offered no defense. No visible efforts were made to quell the rumors. No discreet briefings. No subtle corrections passed through media contacts. It was as if he was choosing not to fight the narrative, perhaps because he couldn't. According to one financial journalist who had interacted with James on multiple occasions, his demeanor had shifted in the past year. Once confident and focused, he had become distracted, often checking his phone, seemingly lost in thought. The journalist recalled a meeting in Zurich where James appeared visibly agitated, making cryptic references to fixing things at home. At the time, it seemed like a generic domestic comment. In hindsight, it felt like a red flag. The allegations grew bolder. By mid-year, a Spanish magazine claimed to have obtained screenshots of WhatsApp messages between James and a woman described as an art consultant, based in Barcelona. The messages, while not graphically explicit, revealed a tone of emotional intimacy. There were references to missed connections, late-night calls, shared memories of past meetings. The magazine didn't publish the full screenshots but quoted segments that hinted at something inappropriate for a married man. Once again, there was no official denial. And now, attention began to turn to Pippa. How much did she know? How long had she known? Was her public silence a sign of ignorance, or a reflection of strategic patience? Insiders began to suggest the latter. One individual close to the Middleton circle alleged that Pippa had known for months, that the signs had been there, and that she had spent a significant amount of time quietly verifying them. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't reactionary. She had made a conscious decision not to react publicly until she had full clarity on what had happened and how she wanted to proceed. She had her children to think about, her public standing. The Middleton name. She wasn't just a woman betrayed by a man, she was a public figure entwined in Britain's most high-profile unofficial royal family. Every decision she made would ripple across press cycles, family dynamics, and public discourse. She couldn't afford to act out of emotion. So she waited. She collected. She planned. And when she finally began sharing the truth with friends, with confidants, with select legal advisors, it wasn't in a panic. It was in measured steps. Her admission, according to one confidant, was hauntingly calm. She said, simply, that she had always known something was wrong. That the distance wasn't just emotional, it was intentional. That at some point, she had stopped being his partner and had become a placeholder. That the intimacy they once had been replaced with a cold professionalism. And that when she finally saw what she needed to see, what confirmed the betrayal, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there and realized the life she had built was over. That moment, more than any other, marked the turning point. Because once the allegations became undeniable, once Pippa allowed herself to acknowledge the betrayal not just privately but consciously, everything else began to fall into place. She instructed her legal team to quietly begin exploring separation terms. She consulted with her family on how to manage the transition. She began drafting statements, not for the media, but for her children, to one day explain why she chose to walk away from a marriage that seemed so perfect on the outside but was so broken within. And while the world debated, speculated, and judged, she remained quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she no longer needed to prove anything. The truth was no longer hidden. It was in the images. It was in the messages. It was in the behavior. It was in the absence of denial. For years, Pippa Middleton had carried the weight of public expectation. She had played her role with dignity, loyalty, and unwavering polish. But betrayal doesn't care about public polish. It doesn't respect discretion. It doesn't stay contained. The allegations were no longer rumors. They had evolved into a story that no one could ignore. And at the center of that storm stood a woman who, despite it all, remained composed, not because she was unshaken, but because she had made peace with the truth. The perfect image had shattered. Now, it was time to rebuild, not the illusion, but something real. By the time the public started to digest the swirling allegations of infidelity and emotional abandonment, the real battle had already been unfolding far from the headlines. Away from the scrutiny of the press and behind the closed doors of a grand Berkshire estate, decisions were being made, truths were being uncovered, and Pippa Middleton was carefully, almost clinically, preparing for the next chapter of her life. This was no spontaneous reaction to a tabloid storm. What happened inside the Middleton-Matthews household was the slow, methodical dismantling of a marriage that had been running on fumes for years. Pippa had always been measured, never brash, never impulsive. And so when the allegations moved from rumors to something resembling evidence, she didn't break down. She investigated. It began with small acts of curiosity. Late-night checking of schedules that didn't align. Casual cross-referencing of travel receipts against what James had said. Unreturned calls. Disconnected explanations. There was no single piece of definitive evidence, no photograph of a kiss, no text that explicitly screamed betrayal. What Pippa found was something even more chilling, a mosaic of inconsistency. Sources close to the family say Pippa began logging inconsistencies. A conversation that didn't match the dinner reservation. A claimed business trip that had no associated flight bookings. Dates and locations that contradicted his public calendar. It was meticulous. Painful. But it was necessary. She wasn't looking for scandal. She was looking for truth. She needed to be sure. Not for the media. For herself. At one point, according to someone close to the legal team later brought on by Pippa, she quietly hired a private investigator. It wasn't dramatic. No trench coats or stakeouts. It was a professional. Discreet. Silent. The goal wasn't to catch James in the act. It was to determine if the suspicion had merit. Weeks passed. Nothing explosive was returned. No smoking gun. But the findings weren't comforting either. James's travel patterns, his meetings, his communication habits. They all pointed to something more than just business. There were meetings that didn't make sense. Encounters that had no explanation. Associates who were described as friends but never named, never seen. It was enough. From that point forward, the tone shifted. Pippa, armed with her quiet certainty, changed the dynamic of the house. No accusations. No scenes. Just space. Emotional distance that was already there became physical. They stopped sharing meals regularly. Their communication was reduced to essentials, schedules, childcare, logistics. They were no longer husband and wife. They were cohabiting strangers, held together by appearances and routine. And then came the family involvement. The Middleton family is known for its discipline, its loyalty, and above all, its discretion. Carol and Michael Middleton had raised their children to value privacy above spectacle. But this was not just any marriage. This was the marriage of their daughter, the woman who had once captured global hearts at a royal wedding, and who had spent years shielding herself from the more toxic sides of fame. When Pippa finally opened up to her mother, it was not in tears, it was in resignation. She explained what she had found. The inconsistencies. The silence. The subtle but steady betrayal. And Carol, in her controlled and composed way, supported her daughter with calm resolve. There was no demand for confrontation, no push for public retaliation. Instead, there was strategy. Carol began helping Pippa lay the groundwork for a dignified exit. No leaks, no interviews, no impulsive statements, just preparation. Financial advisors were consulted. Legal steps were initiated, not for divorce just yet, but for protection. The estate was evaluated. Shared accounts were audited. Trusts for the children were reviewed. Every move was about preservation, not of the marriage, but of legacy, dignity, and control. Inside the house, staff were instructed to operate as usual. No one was told explicitly what was going on, but the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. According to one longtime employee, the silence became a presence in itself. The kind of silence that made people speak more softly, move more carefully, as if the walls themselves were trying to hold back the collapse of something sacred. James, for his part, did not challenge the change. Perhaps he saw it coming. Perhaps he believed he could salvage things with time. Perhaps, as some sources suggest, he simply chose to retreat, into his work, into his routine, into his own version of denial. There were no loud arguments, no midnight fights, just the sound of two people slowly drifting away from each other while pretending to the outside world that nothing had changed. The children were kept at the center of everything. Whatever pain Pippa was feeling, she never allowed it to disrupt their lives. School runs continued. Birthday parties were planned. Bedtime routines remained uninterrupted. Her role as a mother became her anchor, her purpose, and in many ways, her armor. She could hold everything together, even as her own heart unraveled. Eventually, the moment came when Pippa could no longer keep everything internal. A private meeting was arranged, not with the press, not with friends, but with legal counsel. She laid out the findings. She explained the emotional state of the marriage. She described her husband's prolonged absences, the suspicion, the lack of transparency. And with calm precision, she asked for options. Not ultimatums. Options. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about peace. For herself. For her children. For the life she wanted to rebuild without carrying the weight of a crumbling partnership. This stage of the unraveling was never meant for public consumption. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sensational. But it was heartbreaking. Because here was a woman who had done everything right, who had upheld tradition, honored discretion, nurtured her family, and still found herself staring at the ruins of a relationship that once promised forever. There were moments of reflection, even doubt. Pippa is said to have questioned herself repeatedly. Could she have done more? Was there a point when she should have spoken up? Did she ignore signs she should have seen? The questions haunted her, not because she believed she was to blame, but because endings, even necessary ones, carry guilt. Behind the scenes, support came quietly. From her sister Kate, who although bound by royal protocol, found private ways to reassure and uplift. From close friends who didn't ask intrusive questions but offered time, space, and loyalty. From her parents, who had built their lives around stability and now extended that same stability to their daughter in her time of need. As the weeks turned into months, a new rhythm emerged. Pippa began to envision a life not built around appearances, but around healing. She stopped pretending. She stopped waiting. She stopped hoping that the distance could be closed. Instead, she began preparing for independence, not just in legal terms, but emotionally. And James? He remained mostly silent. When approached by family members, he offered vague responses. He didn't deny everything, but he never fully admitted either. His answers were elusive, frustrating, incomplete. To some, it seemed he didn't fully grasp what was at stake. To others, it appeared he was trying to keep the peace, not out of love, but out of fear of fallout. Behind closed doors, the final moments of the marriage played out not with fireworks, but with quiet resignation. The kind of ending that doesn't come with a bang, but with a sigh. The kind of ending that leaves no villains, just people who stop being right for each other, and a silence that finally demanded to be heard. Pippa Middleton, after years of guarding her privacy, had finally made her choice. The illusion had ended. The truth had been confronted. The performance was over. Now, the only thing left to do was begin again. Every relationship has a threshold, a point at which the mind and heart can no longer reconcile the gap between what is and what should be. For Pippa Middleton, that point came not with one grand betrayal, but in the slow, painful accumulation of disillusionment. It was the final straw, the unspoken moment when something deep inside her clicked and said, no more. There was no singular confrontation, No loud argument that spilled into the halls of their estate. No slammed doors, no raised voices. That was never their style. Their undoing was measured, composed, like everything else in their public life. But make no mistake, the ending was no less devastating just because it was quiet. It came after a trip James took to Dubai. He had gone for business. A new investment initiative, according to the brief explanation he gave. He was gone for a week. The return date shifted twice. His explanations were vague, unsatisfying. Pippa didn't push. She didn't accuse. She simply watched. Observed the way his eyes darted when she asked him simple questions. Noticed the distance in his voice when he described his meetings. And she felt the final threads of trust slipping away. When he returned, they sat down to dinner. Just the two of them. The children were asleep. The staff had gone home. The table was perfectly set, like always. But something was different. Pippa didn't reach for small talk. She didn't smile politely. She looked at him, and after a long silence, she asked the question that had been burning inside her for weeks. Are you still in this marriage? James, according to someone close to Pippa, didn't answer right away. He stared at her, then down at his plate, then back at her. His face didn't show guilt. It showed confusion. Or perhaps resignation. As if he had been waiting for this moment, too. His response wasn't dramatic. He didn't confess to anything directly. But what he said was enough. I don't know. In that moment, Pippa felt something break, not in anger, but in clarity. She had been holding on to the idea of their marriage, not the reality. She had been maintaining the shell of a relationship that had hollowed itself out long ago. And now, with those 3 words, the illusion crumbled completely. The days that followed were strangely calm. There were no changes in their routine. The children were still taken to school. The household ran as usual. But inside, Pippa had made her decision. She would not stay in a marriage defined by doubt, by absence, by betrayal. She had given every opportunity for James to recommit, to be honest, to show some fight. And he had offered ambiguity. That wasn't enough. She began the formal steps of separation, not in court, but in strategy. Her lawyers drafted preliminary documents. Private meetings were held to discuss division of assets. A financial audit was commissioned to ensure everything was clear and accounted for. The estate in Berkshire, the property in Chelsea, joint investments, trust funds for the children, it all had to be reviewed. Through it all, Pippa remained emotionally composed. She was hurt, yes, but she was not shattered. She was resolved. And that resolve was terrifying in its calmness. To those around her, it was clear, this wasn't a phase. This wasn't a threat. This was the end. Friends who visited during that time described her as distant, but not cold. Focused. Protective. She smiled less, but when she did, it was real. Not for show. Not for the press. It was the smile of someone who had survived something quietly brutal and had decided not to look back. James, for his part, didn't resist. There was no pleading. No desperate attempt to salvage what was already gone. He complied with legal requests. He kept his distance. And that lack of resistance spoke volumes. He had already left the marriage in spirit, if not in form. The children remained the center of everything. Pippa made sure their routines were untouched. Their emotions protected. She never spoke ill of James in front of them. Never hinted at the truth behind the separation. To them, their parents were simply in different rooms, living slightly different lives. She shielded them as best she could from the reality that had unfolded. And still, no statement was made to the public. Weeks passed. Then months. Media speculation reached a fever pitch. Paparazzi waited outside her estate. Columnists pinned think pieces about the demise of modern marriage among Britain's elite. Still, Pippa said nothing. Not out of fear. Out of choice. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was power. It was control. And in a world where women are often expected to spill their pain for public consumption, Pippa chose dignity. Eventually, it reached a point where she could no longer delay the inevitable. The separation had to become official. Legal documents were filed quietly. A private arrangement was drawn up, one that respected both parties and protected the children. No public divorce announcement. No courtroom drama. Just paperwork, executed in silence. The breaking point had come and gone. Now, there was only aftermath. And in that aftermath, something unexpected happened. Pippa began to breathe again. The weight of years of emotional confusion, of performance, of doubt, it lifted. Slowly, cautiously, but steadily. She began to reemerge, not as the woman she was before James, but as someone entirely new. She took control of her schedule. She resumed her charitable work. She reconnected with friends she had distanced herself from during the most difficult parts of her marriage. Her eyes began to reflect not pain, but determination. Not everything was easy. There were lonely nights, unanswered questions, moments of grief, but there was also peace. And peace, after years of emotional volatility, felt like a victory. She wasn't rushing into anything. Not into dating. Not into public appearances. She took her time. She healed privately. She made decisions deliberately. And as time passed, those who knew her best began to notice the change. She had stopped looking back. There's a kind of quiet power in knowing when to walk away. Not because you've run out of love, but because you've run out of reasons to keep pretending. For Pippa Middleton, that power didn't come from anger or revenge. It came from clarity, from truth, from the realization that a woman who values her worth doesn't stay where she's doubted. The breaking point had come, and from it, she began to build something far more honest than the illusion she had left behind. The moment news of the quiet separation reached the public domain, the media machine exploded into action. Pippa Middleton's personal life had always been of interest to the British press, but her handling of this marital unraveling, so composed, so silent, created a frenzy that no one could fully control. At first, there was confusion. The official documents, discreetly filed through legal channels, offered no dramatic statements or scandalous language. There were no claims of wrongdoing, no admissions, just a formal, measured legal indication that the marriage had ended. But in a world obsessed with narrative, the absence of information only intensified speculation. Tabloids that had once praised Pippa's elegant lifestyle now pivoted to more invasive coverage. Headlines ranged from respectful curiosity to unfiltered intrusion. One paper ran with the headline, "Is this the end of the Middleton magic?" Another speculated wildly, "Affairs, silence, and separation." What really drove Pippa away? And while Pippa herself remained entirely silent, refusing to entertain interviews, leaks, or any interaction with the press, the media's appetite grew. Journalists reached out to former friends, ex-staff members, stylists, even people who had attended the wedding years prior. Everyone was a potential source. Everyone's memory of an offhand comment or quiet glance was suddenly framed as a clue. The stories poured in. Some claimed the marriage had been dead for years. Others argued it was a recent rupture, a final straw after James's alleged emotional neglect. One tabloid reported that Pippa had been seen crying in a cafe weeks before the filing, while another insisted that she had been spotted laughing with a mystery man during a dinner in Notting Hill. The contradiction didn't matter. What mattered was clicks, and Pippa's pain had now become front-page fodder. And yet, the most surprising aspect of this unfolding storm was the public's reaction. While the media churned through theories and innuendos, the general public took a different stance. Social media lit up, not with mockery or disdain, but with support. Thousands of messages flooded platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook expressing sympathy for Pippa. Women around the world shared their own stories of quiet betrayal, of marriages that unraveled not with shouting, but with silence. The hashtag #StandWithPippa began to trend in the UK and soon spread to parts of Europe and the US. People saw her silence not as weakness, but as resilience. They admired the way she protected her children from the spotlight, the way she refused to engage in the tit-for-tat drama that defined so many celebrity breakups. Her refusal to turn the separation into a performance earned her something rare in the modern media world: respect. But not everyone was kind. Certain columnists, particularly those aligned with traditionalist views, criticized her decision. One article accused her of undermining the sanctity of marriage, claiming that if Pippa Middleton, with all her advantages and opportunities, couldn't make it work, what message does that send to the rest of us? The article was widely condemned and ultimately retracted after public backlash, but it revealed an undercurrent of misogyny that still lingered in elite media spaces. Meanwhile, James Matthews, who had maintained a nearly invisible public presence throughout his marriage, now found himself reluctantly dragged into the spotlight. Paparazzi staked out his usual haunts. Photos of him leaving his Chelsea office, walking alone, or dining with male colleagues were published with captions filled with suspicion and judgment. He didn't speak to the press. He issued no statements. But the silence that once made him seem mysterious now made him look guilty. Business outlets took a different interest. Financial blogs and private equity publications began scrutinizing his recent deals, searching for any instability or distraction that might link to the personal turmoil. Some pointed to a noticeable drop in activity from his firm. Others highlighted unverified reports of strained investor meetings. While there was no direct proof of professional fallout, the timing raised eyebrows. Behind the scenes, the Middleton family closed ranks. Carol and Michael Middleton issued no comments. Neither did Kate or Prince William. But their support was felt. A few carefully chosen photos made their way into the press, Pippa out with her mother, smiling softly while pushing a stroller, a candid of her walking with Kate in a private garden, both women dressed casually, heads close in conversation. These photos weren't accidental. They were signals. Not from Pippa, but from the family. She wasn't alone. Even more telling was the reaction from royal circles. While no formal royal statement was made. Understandably, given that Pippa is not a working royal, the whispers from inside the palace were sympathetic. Palace aides who spoke anonymously indicated that Pippa's discretion during the royal family's most turbulent years had earned her a kind of quiet respect among courtiers. She had never sought attention. She had never used her connection to the Princess of Wales for gain. And now, as she endured one of the most personal betrayals imaginable, she continued to protect the monarchy's image by refusing to turn her pain into a media storm. For weeks, the media coverage continued in waves. The first wave was about the separation itself. The second focused on speculation, new partners, old resentments, future arrangements. The third, however, was something different. It was reflection. Op-eds began to appear, reconsidering the public's treatment of women like Pippa. Writers questioned why her every move had been dissected for years, why her body had been objectified during Kate's wedding, why her value had always been tied to her relationships. These articles didn't just defend her, they critiqued the system that had turned her into a symbol rather than a person. And amid all of this, Pippa continued her silence. She didn't post on Instagram. She didn't attend red carpet events. She didn't take part in interviews. Her only public appearances were at charity events she had long been committed to, where she smiled gently, spoke warmly, and said nothing of her personal life. In those moments, the media had no choice but to report what was in front of them, a woman who was living her truth without exploiting it. Eventually, the frenzy began to fade. As with all news cycles, attention drifted elsewhere. New scandals emerged. Other stories stole the front pages. And as the media slowly moved on, Pippa Middleton remained. Stronger, quieter, still composed. Her handling of the media storm had become its own kind of statement. Not with quotes, not with declarations, but with silence and with presence. She hadn't played the victim. She hadn't played the villain. She had simply told the truth by how she lived it. And for that, she had won not just the public's sympathy, but its admiration. While the world watched Pippa Middleton handle her separation with quiet grace and discretion, those closest to her knew that what appeared outwardly as composure was masking a profound psychological toll. Behind her poised exterior, Pippa was navigating the deepest kind of emotional storm, the kind that not only shakes a person's self-worth but also makes them question everything they believed about love, trust, and their own identity. In the weeks following the announcement of her separation from James Matthews, Pippa seemed to grow more introspective. She still smiled in public, still maintained a firm hold on her role as a mother and philanthropist, but those who were close to her could see the subtle signs of strain. Her energy, once lively and full of purpose, had become more subdued. She was quieter than she had ever been before, often retreating into herself when the cameras weren't watching. The weight of betrayal is difficult to quantify. It doesn't always come in the form of a loud argument or a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it is more insidious, a slow unraveling of trust, piece by piece, until you're left wondering who you are and what you stand for. For Pippa, this emotional erosion was compounded by the public scrutiny that followed every move she made. She wasn't just dealing with the collapse of a marriage, she was doing so under the harsh light of the media's gaze. Psychologists who work with individuals going through similar separations suggest that the trauma of betrayal can create a ripple effect throughout every aspect of one's life. It leads to self-doubt, questioning of past decisions, and, often, a complete reshaping of how one views relationships in the future. For Pippa, the questions were many. How had she not seen the signs sooner? Was she blind to James's emotional withdrawal? Did she ignore the small moments that, in hindsight, were clear red flags? The self-blame was subtle, but it was there. But perhaps the most insidious toll was on her self-esteem. Pippa Middleton, for all the media attention she had received over the years, had never been one to seek validation through public approval. She was known for her self-sufficiency, her quiet elegance, and her ability to live a life outside the bright lights of royal fame. But the dissolution of her marriage and the subsequent media coverage that dissected every detail of it made her question the very thing that had once grounded her, her identity. In the public eye, Pippa had always been defined by her connection to her sister Kate and the royal family, but she had worked hard to carve out her own identity. She had her own career, her own relationships, and her own charitable pursuits. Yet, as her marriage began to unravel, she found herself once again tethered to the narrative that others had created for her. She wasn't just Pippa, the woman who had her own life. She was now Pippa Middleton, the woman whose marriage had fallen apart. Psychologically, the struggle was overwhelming. A person's sense of self is often tied to their relationships, and for Pippa, this was no different. Her marriage had been a part of her identity, a source of pride, stability, and future promise. Now, as it disintegrated, she found herself asking fundamental questions about who she was without it. She had built her life on the belief that her relationship with James was one that could weather any storm, but this betrayal shattered that belief. Her close friends observed the changes with a mix of concern and sympathy. They saw how she became more withdrawn during social gatherings, less willing to share the private details of her life. While she had once been open and engaging, now she kept to herself, not wanting to engage in the kinds of conversations that could make her feel exposed. She became more guarded, protecting herself from further emotional harm. At times, the emotional toll took a physical form. Those close to her noted that she looked more fatigued than usual. She wasn't sleeping as well. She had less energy. And while she maintained a strict regimen of physical fitness, even her workouts seemed to lack the same focus they once had. There was a weariness about her, a kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from emotional strain. The constant balancing act of maintaining a public image while privately coping with the breakdown of her marriage was taking its toll on her body and mind. In private, Pippa struggled with feelings of isolation. She had built a life surrounded by family and friends, but now, in the wake of her separation, she felt distanced from the world she had once known. The people she had once trusted to offer comfort seemed to be caught up in their own opinions of her situation. Everyone had something to say, but no one seemed to be able to truly understand what she was going through. She was forced to lean on a select few who had proven themselves unwavering in their support. Her sister Kate, despite her own busy life and royal duties, made time to check in regularly, offering words of encouragement and love. But even that couldn't ease the loneliness Pippa felt inside. As the months passed, the weight of the emotional toll started to evolve. Pippa began to feel a shift. The raw grief of the separation slowly gave way to something else, acceptance. She realized that she had spent too long living in the shadow of what her marriage had been, and not enough time reclaiming her own life. Slowly but surely, she started to find a new sense of purpose, one that wasn't defined by her marriage or the opinions of others. This period of emotional healing was not easy, but it was necessary. Pippa began to re-engage with her passions. She threw herself back into her charitable work, focusing on causes that were close to her heart. She found solace in the small moments, walking through the countryside near her family's estate, playing with her children, and reconnecting with old friends. She rediscovered the joy of living for herself, of finding purpose not in. The psychological toll of betrayal is often long-lasting. Even as time passed, Pippa was forced to confront her feelings of abandonment, rejection, and loss. Yet, in this process, she began to emerge stronger, more resilient, and more in control of her own destiny. She had faced the darkest aspects of her emotional landscape and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but empowered. Her journey toward healing was gradual, and it wasn't without its moments of doubt. There were days when the weight of the past seemed too heavy to bear. But through it all, Pippa never let go of the one thing that had always defined her, her strength. She faced the emotional toll head-on, refusing to be defined by the hurt of the past. Instead, she chose to let it shape her future, not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life, her power, and her sense of self. The moment Pippa Middleton decided to step away from the wreckage of her marriage, she began the difficult and often painful process of rebuilding her life. It was not an immediate transformation. Healing from a betrayal of such magnitude takes time, patience, and a fierce determination to reclaim one's sense of self. For Pippa, this journey was as much about rediscovering her own voice as it was about forging a future without the person who had once been her partner. The first step was acceptance. Pippa had spent months in a state of emotional turmoil, replaying the moments of her marriage and asking herself the same question: how had it gone so wrong? It was a question that had no simple answer, and over time, she realized it wasn't one she needed to keep asking. The answers lay not in the past, but in the present, in the future she could create for herself. This was her moment to let go of the lingering what-ifs and focus on what she could control. Her decision to separate was not just about ending a marriage, it was about choosing herself. She understood that she couldn't go back to the person she had been before her relationship with James. Too much had changed. She had grown, faced her deepest fears, and confronted the truth in ways that she never had before. What remained was a woman who was no longer willing to compromise her values, her self-worth, or her happiness for the sake of a broken relationship. The next phase of rebuilding was physical. Pippa threw herself into her fitness routine once more, something she had always found grounding and empowering. Before the separation, she had kept up with a regular regimen of running, yoga, and Pilates. Now, she took it to a new level, using exercise not just as a way to stay in shape, but as a form of therapy. The physical exertion helped release some of the emotional weight she had been carrying for so long. Each stride on her morning runs, each deep breath in her yoga practice, became an affirmation of strength and resilience. She began to feel her body returning to its best form, not just in appearance, but in feeling strong, capable, and alive. But physical healing was only one part of the puzzle. Pippa's emotional and mental recovery was a far more complex journey. After years of keeping a carefully curated public image, she now faced the task of reclaiming her identity away from the public spotlight. It wasn't that Pippa had ever truly let the media define her, but the pressure of always being seen as the perfect wife, the picture-perfect sister-in-law, had taken a toll on her sense of self. Now, she could move beyond that. She began to explore aspects of herself that she had previously kept in the background. Her philanthropic work, once a side project, became her main focus. She immersed herself in the causes she had always cared about: education, mental health, and environmental sustainability. Pippa had always been involved in charity work, but now it felt different. It wasn't about appearances or fulfilling an obligation. It was about giving back in a way that nourished her own soul. Her commitment to these causes grew stronger as she found new purpose in helping others, using her platform for good. Family, too, became a crucial part of her healing. Throughout the years, Pippa had always been close to her parents, Carol and Michael Middleton. But in the wake of her separation, she drew even closer to them. Carol, in particular, had been a rock, offering unwavering support without judgment. There were countless evenings spent talking over tea, walking through the countryside, and simply being there for each other. Pippa found comfort in these simple moments, reminders of a life rooted in love, not in external validation. Her parents, who had always championed discretion and family unity, became her pillars, providing her with the strength to move forward. But it wasn't just her family that offered her solace. As Pippa rebuilt her life, she also reconnected with old friends who had been there before the spotlight, before the royal wedding, before the cameras. These friendships, grounded in history and shared experiences, reminded Pippa of the person she had been before fame took hold of her life. They offered her a safe space, free of judgment, where she could speak freely about her feelings and fears. As the months passed, Pippa's emotional resilience began to show.